So welcome everyone. We are going to backtrack just a little bit. Just turning the volume up here for you. I'm making a few lecture recordings, and I'm hoping that this will help supplement your learning. Again, you'll notice that in all of my communications with you, my goal is to make sure that you're successful. And for you to be successful, sometimes I have to spiral back to the beginning to make sure that we're all on the same page with the concepts and especially the perspective for world history, because to me that's very critical. History itself, the lens or the perspective for which we approach it, helps you to be a valuable member of society. And as you work towards your goals, there's a lot of skills that you will learn in history that will help you to be successful no matter what your path is. So what I'm doing for each of the modules, currently we're working in Module 5 for the course. However, what I'm doing is going back and making these lecture recordings for each module to help, again, give you some supplemental information. So I want to start with the introduction. As you recall, if you look through some of the documents that I provided for you in module, I believe it was 1, we spoke a little bit about what is history and why do we study the past. So essentially, history is the record of mankind on earth. But not only is it a record of mankind in itself, as far as in the facts, who writes history matters. That in itself is a record. When you look back at ancient and historical documents, the person that is writing history, especially in the past, was usually representing those in power. So not only is just the facts of who, what, when, where important, but who was writing that history is also critical. That in itself, the content and who was writing the content, is a record of mankind. The earth was created about 2 to 6 billion years ago, and man made his appearance, as far as in what we can prove through scientific methods, about 1,750,000 years ago. That's where we have our record. So let me restate that because I messed up on that number. 1,750,000 years ago is when we have evidence as far as in man's existence. So if you recall, if you've heard this again, great. I'm sorry. I just want to make sure I emphasize it. But if you had forgotten or missed this part in the beginning of the class, the reasons for studying world history is that it helps us understand the past. It shows us how our present way of life has developed, and we become familiar with the accomplishment of people in other countries and really other civilizations. It helps us not only, probably saying people in other countries is not accurate. That's too narrow of a lens. What it helps us become familiar with is people in general. And it also helps you develop critical thinking skills. So if you'll remember back to the first modules, I posted some of the critical reasons that or skills that you'll develop through history, and critical thinking was a very important part of that. So it says, if the time of Earth equaled the size of the Empire State Building, man's existence would be at the very tip. So if you're not familiar with the Empire State Building, that could be something you look up on your own so you can understand that analogy. There's a photo here on the left, and you can take some notes, or what I really encourage you to do is just pause this recording and look through that image, and so that you can kind of get an understanding of the timing. And again, that's using the visual of the Empire State Building so that you can kind of get an understanding of sequentially and time-wise, how things developed. So hopefully you've paused to look at that, because that helps you in your understanding. Again, this may be repeat. Some of you may not have caught this, but it is important, especially if you move through world history, to understand the difference in AD and BC. So I'll pause for a few minutes so that you can read the slide. Again, I have a strong suggestion for you. Instead of me pausing in live time, in other words, instead of me letting a video play for, say, 2 minutes while I pause, what I'm going to recommend for you to do is pause this video, take your notes, read through this, because I don't want to read every slide to you, and make sure that you understand this. Now, BCE is used now more in history than BC. The difference is that BC is, like it says here on the slide, before the birth of Christ. BCE is before the Common Era. It takes the religious perspective out. So hopefully you will pause and take a few notes here. So here's an activity if you want to practice your timeline skills to make sure that you're able to, this is kind of a practice activity. It's like a self-test. So you do this and then you let me know if you're struggling, or you might just search out some resources to help yourself, because it's important to make sure that you understand timelines. So here's an activity. If you feel comfortable with timelines, you do not have to pause this and do this activity. This is really where you have to self-regulate. And again, you would pause the video to complete the task. So let me go back up here. Let's see if I can make that smaller for you. Oops, that went the opposite way. Okay, so that gives everything on the same slide for you. Okay, so timeline. Here's another activity. These are recommendations, suggestions, however you want to take it, so that you can practice some of your skills that you'll need. You know, one of the most important things about college is that, you know, the professor provides you the tools or provides you the mechanisms, but it's really up to the student to kind of open that toolbox and get things out when they need it. So this is one of those things where you open your toolbox, here's what's in here as an activity, a practice activity. So you have to make that determination on whether or not you need that tool or not. So this is a little exit slip that I've used before to help me kind of dipstick whether or not students are understanding the concepts that are being presented. So this would be something for yourself. This is a self-assessment. I want to go over kind of the major periods of history again. I'm really big into setting a strong foundation early on in the course. So you may see that some of the chapters, you know, just really dig straight into the content, and that's all fine and well and great. But what I've noticed is that by me giving you some of these additional resources and kind of starting slow, I've already noticed a great improvement in your abilities to write discussion posts, and so I'm hoping that that continues to translate over. Of course, the pace, and I've mentioned this, I believe, before, the pace will increase. However, you know, because we've got to get to the content and continue to make our way through the content. But, you know, a lot of reading, you can do that on your own time. I've given you some strategies for how to read, how to take notes, how to kind of do active reading, you know, those types of skills. And again, that's really kind of on your own as far as in whether or not you choose to do that successfully or not. But anyway, going over the major periods of history, what that has to do with this is that this kind of gives you a broad lens. If you're like me, I kind of need to know the big broad things before I get into the specifics. So if you have this broad knowledge, then it allows you to operate within that broad knowledge more effectively or more successfully. So I'm hoping that some of this broad knowledge helps you as you dig into some of the content. And again, this is where you would pause to take notes, or what I really recommend is, you know, printing out material and highlighting, writing notes in your own words. So if this is a 15-minute video, I mean, it could take you 30, 45 minutes to get through it because you're self-pacing your notes and the activities. You know, you're making sure that you walk away with the understandings that you need. So we've got medieval history here. And of course, your second course, so if you're in history, 112 or 1112, or if you are not now, but you will be in a future or upcoming semester or quarter, then you'll really get into modern history, which is 1500 to present. So, you know, when we're looking at the history, we really have to look at the sources. I kind of mentioned this, touched on this a little bit at the beginning of the video. You need to make sure that you know what you're looking at, because there's primary sources, there's secondary sources. You know, who wrote if it's a written material, you know, who wrote it is important, because generally in history, before the kind of modern times, generally those who wrote history were those who worked for, were the people who worked for those in power. And so if you were in power, you're not going to pay somebody or have somebody on your payroll, essentially, who's going to write something negative about you. So even if you were, you know, not the greatest, best person, then you're not going to allow your historian, quote unquote, to write that. You know, there was definitely a lot of oversight. So we really have to be careful when we look at sources to make sure that we know who's writing. A modern day example of that is newspapers or online social media type news outlets that are funded by a political party or funded by a special interest group. Of course, they're going to slant the material, and so knowing your sources of history is important, because one, there's, you know, objects, and then there's written records for which we have to really give a critical lens to. So history is not just history. It's, you know, definitely broad, and then also there's different you know, there's like an umbrella of history, but there's many different subtopics and people who study different parts of history, and so this is a few of those. I will again say, just for another reminder, to pause this video to take notes as it's necessary. So our earliest civilizations, I think this is a really great graphic for you to be able to see those civilizations that we are going to be talking about. So, you know, you pull up a world map. Most of you may, I would guess, most of you, there might be some of you that's lived in Europe or the Pacific, but I would take a guess that most of you are not familiar with this side of the world, and so having this perspective here might allow you to kind of see where these earliest civilizations were located. So, you know, here's Italy. Most of you are familiar with Italy. So this is mainland Europe, and so hopefully that kind of helps you out. And then, you know, of course, this is the Pacific over here. Alrighty, so I think this is one of the probably the better parts of this presentation, because it allows you to kind of see some of those civilizations. You know, we've already gotten into China. We talked about the Indus River Valley, Mesopotamia. We touched on Egypt. You know, this is really good for you to understand who we're studying. Oops, sorry about that. I fast forwarded a little bit. So common terms to know, really I'd rather you know the BCE, and then AD, and then, but of course you need to know why, you know, people used to use BC, so you need to know that. These are some of the things that are really, you don't necessarily need to know these, but the written and unwritten sources, for sure, that's, you know, I think pretty common sense, I think. So this is going to conclude my supplemental video or lecture for the initial module where we talked about what is history. Please do make sure that you read through those notes that were in those early modules. I've given you plenty of time in these first few weeks to make sure that you print materials out, you read, you reread, because we're kind of training ourselves to be successful throughout the rest of the course. That's the intent of me taking it slow with you in the beginning. And I hope you have a good evening, and we'll see you on the next video.